Good evening and welcome back, or welcome for the first time, to our quiet corner of history, where stories move slowly, voices stay calm, and nothing is required of you except to get comfortable. Maybe adjust your pillow just a little, and let the world outside fade for a while. And before we begin, I'm genuinely curious. Where are you listening from tonight? Is it late evening, very early morning, or somewhere in between? And if you feel like it, let us know in the comments, because we truly read them and love knowing how far these stories travel. And don't worry if you're already half asleep, you don't need to answer right away. You can always come back later. But if you're enjoying this kind of slow, thoughtful storytelling, it really helps us if you gently tap the like button and subscribe, because it tells us that these calm, unhurried stories still have a place in a very loud world. And now, with that said, let's begin. Tonight, we're going to travel far from glowing city lights and familiar holiday comforts, back to a time when Christmas arrived quietly, without decorations, without music drifting through the streets, and without any guarantee of warmth or safety, as we explore what Christmas was really like in the 1850s Wild West. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a winter night stretching endlessly across the American frontier, where the wind doesn't brush past decorated storefronts or snow-covered sidewalks, but sweeps over vast open plains, rattles unfinished wooden cabins, and carries with it the scent of smoke, raw timber, and frozen earth. And somewhere out there, far from anything we would recognize as festive, Christmas is arriving anyway. When we think of Christmas today, we often picture abundance, tables heavy with food, familiar songs, and the comforting certainty that tomorrow will still be warm and safe. But for the men, women, and children living in the Wild West during the 1850s, Christmas was not a pause from hardship. It was simply another fragile day, folded carefully into a long and unforgiving winter, where survival mattered more than celebration, and hope had to be quiet in order to last. The American West of the 1850s was not yet a myth or a legend, but a place of distance and isolation, where settlements were scattered far apart, communication was slow or non-existent, and families often faced the winter months with only what they had managed to store, build, or hunt with their own hands. And Christmas, when it came, arrived without announcements, without packages, and without certainty. For many pioneer families, Christmas morning began the same way every other winter morning did, with the soft sound of wind pressing against the cabin walls, with breath turning visible in the cold air, and with the careful calculation of how much wood remained, how much food could be spared, and whether the fire could be kept alive through another long night. Part 1 of our story begins inside a small frontier cabin, roughly built from freshly cut logs, their gaps sealed with mud and straw, the floor made of packed earth, and the windows, if there were any at all, covered with oiled paper or thin hides that allowed only a pale, bluish winter light to slip inside. And in this quiet, dim space, Christmas did not announce itself with joy or ceremony, but with the familiar crackle of damp wood in the stove, and the steady patience of people who had learned not to expect too much. Food on Christmas Day was simple and measured, perhaps a thin porridge made from flour and water, maybe slightly sweetened with a drop of molasses saved for rare occasions, or dried meat softened slowly near the fire. And the very act of preparing something even a little different from the day before was, in itself, a kind of celebration. Children, especially the youngest ones, sensed that this day was different, not because of gifts or decorations, but because voices were gentler, movements slower, and stories were told more often. Stories about places left behind, about warmer homes, familiar faces, and Christmases that once felt easier, as if remembering them could briefly warm the cold air inside the cabin. For the adults, Christmas in the 1850s Wild West was a moment of quiet reflection, a pause in which doubts and hopes mingled together, where the decision to come west was weighed silently against the cost it demanded, and where faith, endurance, and patience became the true traditions of the season. And as the short winter days slowly passed without ceremony or spectacle, Christmas revealed its true meaning on the frontier, not as a celebration of abundance, but as an exercise in resilience, where hope did not shine brightly, but instead burned softly, like a carefully guarded fire meant to last through the long night ahead. As evening crept across the prairie, the light changed in a way that only those who've lived through long winters can recognize. The last streaks of pale gold faded into a steel-blue horizon, and the sky became a heavy dome, pressing close above the frozen land. Smoke from dozens of small fires rose into the still air and stayed there, hanging low, unmoving, as though even the wind had grown tired of the cold. Inside the cabin, shadows lengthened slowly. The stove glowed a dull orange, and the single candle on the table flickered against the rough walls, making the room seem almost alive. Outside, everything had vanished under snow. The world was silent, except for the faint groan of the wood as it contracted in the cold. No one spoke for a while. Words felt unnecessary when the sound of the fire was already enough, a rhythm that promised warmth. And in a place like that, warmth was everything. Eventually, someone might hum a melody, not quite a song, but a thread of memory. A tune carried from the east, where winters were gentler and Christmas meant church bells, roasted apples, and laughter spilling from taverns onto lamplit streets. Out here, that world seemed impossibly far away. A mother might tell her children about the Christmases of her own childhood, about snow that fell soft instead of sharp, and about the smell of baked bread drifting through a real window instead of an oiled hide. Her voice would slow as she spoke, her eyes fixed on the fire, seeing places that no longer existed except in memory. The father, sitting nearby, might listen without interrupting. He would poke the fire, careful not to waste a single spark, and nod from time to time, not because he didn't remember, but because he remembered too well. They had traded all of that comfort for this, a chance at land, at freedom, at something better, though on nights like this, the promise felt thin against the sound of the wind. And yet, something sacred still lingered in that silence. When the children finally grew quiet and the candle burned low, the family would sit together in the glow of the coals. Someone might whisper a prayer, simple, unpolished, born out of gratitude rather than ceremony. They thanked God not for gifts or gold, but for survival, for another morning, another fire, another chance. Outside, the snow fell harder, softening the edges of the world. The small cabin became a tiny island of life in a sea of white. The stars began to appear one by one, cold and bright, hanging over the plains like 1,000 watchful eyes. Inside, the warmth deepened. The walls creaked, the fire sighed, and the long night settled in. For a few hours, time seemed to pause. The frontier, with all its dangers and distances, disappeared. There was only the quiet breathing of the living, the crackle of wood, and the faint scent of smoke curling through the roof beams, a fragile peace held together by faith and will. Morning arrived not with trumpets or church bells, but with a grey, muted light that seeped through the cracks in the walls, pale and uncertain, as though even the sun was hesitant to face the cold. The cabin stirred slowly, not because anyone had slept deeply, but because rest in those winters was something closer to survival than comfort. A few soft movements, the rustle of a blanket, the sigh of boots pulled onto cold feet, and the day began. The fire from the night before had nearly died, just a faint orange pulse among the ashes, but that tiny ember meant everything. With gentle hands and practiced patience, the father coaxed it back to life, feeding it slivers of wood until the cabin filled again with the faint hiss of heat meeting frost. The smoke twisted upward, curling lazily around the rafters, and for the first time that morning, warmth returned. Outside, the world was untouched, as though creation itself had been wiped clean overnight. The snow glittered faintly beneath the pale sky, and every sound, the crunch of a step, the cry of a distant raven, seemed to echo for miles. No sleighs, no church choirs, no jingling bells, only the deep, endless stillness of the frontier. The family ate quietly. The same food as the night before, maybe a little thinner now, but no one complained. On the table sat a small wooden cup filled with pine needles steeped in hot water, their makeshift tea. It smelled sharp and clean, like life itself distilled from the forest. The mother smiled faintly as she watched the steam rise, her eyes glimmering in the half-light. She didn't need words to know that this too was a gift. Outside the cabin, the father stepped into the snow to check on the animals. His breath fogged in the air, curling like smoke. The horses shifted in the pen, their backs crusted with frost, eyes dark and watchful. He rubbed one between the ears and whispered something soft, perhaps a wish, perhaps a prayer. When he looked back at the cabin, its chimney breathing thin white smoke into the frozen morning, it struck him how small it seemed, how fragile, and yet how it endured, holding warmth against a world determined to freeze it out. He stood there for a moment, listening. Somewhere behind him, the children were laughing, not loud or wild, but softly, the way laughter sounds when it's shared by people who know its worth. Inside, the mother had taken a scrap of cloth and wrapped a small piece of candy, the last one saved from a distant town months ago. She placed it in the hands of her youngest child, whose eyes widened with disbelief, as though holding a treasure. There were no ribbons, no tree, no glittering lights, only the kindness of that gesture, simple and unspoken. By midday the light grew stronger. Snow melted slightly on the cabin roof and dripped in slow, steady drops. The sound was almost musical, a rhythm of renewal, quiet and pure. The family gathered by the door for a moment, looking out across the open plains. The sky stretched forever, pale and endless, and though there was nothing beneath it but snow and silence, something inside each of them whispered that this too was enough. Christmas in the Wild West didn't need grandeur. It needed resilience, and love that could survive distance, hunger, and cold. Out there, that was the miracle. Not the feast, but the endurance of faith itself. By the time afternoon began to lean into evening, the world outside had turned to silver. The snow reflected the dying light in a soft, endless shimmer, and everything seemed to hold its breath again, as if waiting for the dark to settle. The family had done what they always did. The chores were finished, the animals fed, the fire fed once more. There was nothing extravagant about the day, but nothing was missing either. For them, survival was its own kind of celebration. The father sat by the stove, his hands rough and still, a faint line of soot drawn across his thumb from feeding the fire too many times. The mother was mending a shirt in the glow of a single candle, her needle catching the light each time it passed through the cloth. Outside, the wind began to hum against the cabin, but softly now, no longer the voice of danger, but a lullaby for the land. As the children grew drowsy, someone began to hum again. Not a carol, exactly, but something older, a tune carried west across generations, sung quietly enough that it blended with the sound of the fire. It wasn't meant for anyone but them. In that moment, it felt like the world had shrunk to the size of their small room, the night closing gently around them like a blanket. When the last of the daylight vanished, the family shared one final look into the flames. They didn't speak much. Words weren't needed. The glow of the fire touched their faces, tired, lined, but peaceful, and for a brief instant, they looked like figures carved into the very heart of the frontier, fragile yet unyielding. Far away, beyond the plains and mountains, other families were celebrating in towns lit by gas lamps, exchanging gifts, clinking glasses, singing loud and bright. But here, on the edge of the known world, Christmas was quieter, stripped of every comfort except the ones that truly mattered. A roof, a flame, and each other. In that stillness, faith didn't shout. It whispered, it spoke through calloused hands, through the patience of mending cloth, through the steady rhythm of a man breathing beside a dying fire. It reminded them that even in the coldest season, even at the world's edge, warmth could still be made, not found, not bought, but made. Outside, the stars returned, sharp and white, like frost frozen into the sky. The cabin was barely a speck beneath them, a single ember glowing in the dark. Yet from that tiny ember light spread just enough to hold back the night. And perhaps that was the truest shape of Christmas in the 1850s Wild West. Not the miracle of plenty, but the miracle of persistence, of quiet endurance, of a hope that didn't depend on what you had, but on what you refused to lose. The fire hissed softly, the snow settled, and sleep came at last, deep, heavy, and dreamless, carrying them all through the long winter night, while outside the world waited silently for morning to come again. By the time the night returned, the world outside the cabin had turned almost silver blue, a color that only winter seems to know. The plains lay quiet under the weight of fresh snow, their edges blurred, their distances infinite. Smoke drifted from the chimney in a slow, lazy spiral, the only sign of life for miles. Inside, the warmth clung to the air like something fragile, something made by human hands, and held together by will alone. The family moved softly, speaking little because on nights like this, words seemed to break the spell. The father watched the fire with the stillness of a man who'd learned to measure time, not in hours, but in how long the wood would last. The mother leaned against the table, her hands folded loosely, her face lit by the glow of the coals, and her eyes somewhere far beyond the room, perhaps in memory, perhaps in prayer. A sound rose outside, faint, distant, the cry of something wild across the snow. Maybe a coyote, maybe the wind. It came and went so quickly that for a moment no one was sure it had existed at all. The children stirred in their sleep, pulling the blankets tighter, while the fire snapped softly, sending tiny sparks upward that vanished before reaching the rafters. In that small space, time seemed to stretch and bend. The world outside the door could have been yesterday, or 1,000 years ago. It didn't matter. The rhythm of life was slow and circular. Fire, silence, cold, fire again. And in that rhythm lay a peace that few would ever know again. The mother rose after a while, careful not to wake the children. She took a small piece of bread from the shelf, broke it in two, and placed one half beside her husband. Neither spoke. They simply ate in quiet gratitude, the crackle of the fire filling the space where conversation used to live. Outside, the snow began again. Thin at first, then heavier, swirling through the air in soft waves. The sound it made against the roof was gentle, like fingertips brushing against the world. It covered the tracks from earlier, erased the small paths in the yard, and turned the night smooth and whole again. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the reach of the cabin's dim light, another fire might have burned. Another family, another story. A miner deep in the mountains, a trapper huddled under firs beside a half-frozen stream, a lone rider sheltering beneath the black ribs of a canyon wall. The frontier stretched endlessly, and yet every light, every fire, every small human voice made it feel just a little less empty. The pioneers didn't know it, but they were writing the first quiet chapters of something larger, not the legends of outlaws or gold rushes that history would remember, but something far gentler. The story of how ordinary people built warmth from wilderness, how faith survived through silence, and how Christmas, even stripped of its splendor, could still live inside the smallest flicker of hope. Across the plains, the night unfolded without sound. The land seemed endless, stretching from one horizon to another, a frozen ocean of white beneath a sky scattered with sharp, glittering stars. The snow reflected the faint moonlight so completely that it was difficult to tell where the earth ended and the heavens began. And somewhere within that vast emptiness, other lives flickered briefly against the dark. Miles away, in a mining camp half buried in snow, a handful of men huddled around a small fire built in a circle of stones. The wind clawed at their coats and hissed through the seams of their tents. But they laughed anyway, the rough kind of laughter that comes not from joy, but from exhaustion. Someone passed a tin cup filled with whiskey, and when it reached the youngest among them, a boy no older than 17, he held it for a long moment before taking a careful sip, as if tasting adulthood itself. No one spoke of Christmas. They didn't have to. The fire, the company, the silence, that was enough. Further north, deep in a narrow valley, a trapper sat alone beside a river. frozen so solid it sang when the wind passed over it. His cabin was no more than a few logs stacked under a leaning roof, and yet he treated it like a cathedral. He had no gifts, no tree, not even a voice to share the night with. But when he raised his tin cup of coffee to his lips and felt the heat against his skin, he whispered something under his breath. Maybe a prayer, maybe a name, and in that quiet act, the wilderness softened for just a heartbeat. On the edge of a small settlement, another cabin stood with its door half open, spilling warm light into the snow. Inside, a woman was writing by lamplight, her breath clouding faintly in front of her. Each letter she wrote was slow, careful, shaped with hope. She knew the message might never reach the family she had left behind in Missouri, but writing it made them feel closer, as though her words could cross the frozen plains faster than any horse or wagon. When she finally set the pen down, she didn't seal the letter. She simply placed it on the windowsill and smiled. It was enough to have written it. And beyond all of them, further still, out past the last wagon tracks, the prairie lay untouched. Herds of bison slept under the stars, their breath rising like mist. Wolves padded silently through the snow, leaving thin, perfect trails that glimmered in the moonlight. The land itself seemed to rest that night, as if sharing in the stillness of its scattered human guests. From above, the frontier would have looked like a dark sea dotted with embers. Every campfire, every lamp, every cabin window was a heartbeat, a small defiance against the cold. Some glowed steady, others flickered weakly, but all of them together formed a constellation of survival across the vast emptiness. In each light burned the same quiet spirit, endurance, gratitude, and the unspoken understanding that even in the harshest corners of the world, people would still find a way to remember warmth. By the time the stars began to fade, the world had turned the color of pearl. The air grew lighter, and somewhere beyond the horizon, a thin band of gold crept upward, hesitant at first, like a promise that might still be broken. The snow, untouched through the night, glittered with a new kind of light, cold and soft, as if the earth itself was slowly awakening from a deep, wordless dream. In the mining camp, the fire had burned to ash. The men were already stirring, faces pale with sleep, eyes heavy but calm. One of them rose, stretched, and looked toward the east, his breath clouding in the frozen air. For a long moment he said nothing, only watched the faint blush of dawn spread over the ridges. It wasn't much, just a thin strip of light in a sea of grey, but in that silence it felt like a blessing. Far off in the valley, the trapper pushed open his cabin door. A rush of cold air met him, sharp enough to sting his eyes, but the world outside was so still, so full of fragile colour, that he forgot the chill for a moment. The river beneath its shell of ice gleamed like glass, and a single crow cut across the sky, its wings black against the morning. He stood there until his breath turned to frost on his beard, and then he smiled to himself, not out of joy exactly, but out of recognition. He had made it through another night. The woman who had been writing by lamplight stirred awake at her small table, her head resting beside the letter she'd never sealed. The oil lamp had gone out, but a silver light now filled the room. She turned her gaze to the window and saw the snow shining outside like a sea of diamonds. Her hands were cold, her back ached, but her heart felt strangely light. Without thinking, she reached for the letter again, added one more line, "I am still here," and set it back on the sill. Back in that first cabin on the plains, the family began to stir. The fire had died down again, but there was enough warmth left to spark new life. The father stepped outside and looked toward the dawn, squinting against the pale brightness. The snow stretched forever, clean and untouched, and for a moment it felt like standing on the edge of creation itself. Behind him, the sound of soft voices reached his ears, the children waking, the mother humming low, the faint rustle of life returning. The first true rays of sunlight spilled across the land. Then, slow, golden, almost hesitant, catching on the frost, on the rooftops, on the smoke still curling from the chimneys of scattered homes, The entire west seemed to shimmer. No one shouted, no bells rang, no choirs sang. And yet, it felt holy. This quiet awakening, this fragile light reborn out of the dark. As the day began, each small settlement, each lonely cabin, each fading ember came alive again under that same soft sun. The men stoked their fires, the women boiled water for bread, the children laughed at the strange squeak of their boots in the snow. There were no gifts to unwrap, no grand feast to prepare, only the gentle, unspoken joy of being alive to see another morning. And somewhere far off, perhaps in a place none of them would ever reach, a train whistle echoed faintly across the plains, distant, haunting, beautiful. It was the sound of the world moving on, of new lives beginning where the old ones had endured. The sun climbed higher, melting the frost from window panes, turning the snow to silver water that trickled softly down the roofs. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and smoke, and for the first time in months, it almost felt warm. It was Christmas still, not loud, not grand, not filled with celebration, but alive in every quiet thing the light touched. By midday, the frontier had begun to thaw in the faint sunlight. The air still bit at the skin, but there was something gentler about it now, as though the world had remembered that life still existed here. The snow no longer looked merciless, but clean, and the endless plains shimmered faintly under a sky washed pale blue. From the distance, the smoke of other cabins could be seen, thin grey lines rising lazily into the air like quiet signals of survival. In the small settlement, the families began to move. There were no roads, only narrow paths pressed into the snow by boots and sleds. But one by one they followed those trails toward their neighbors. The sound of footsteps broke the stillness, soft and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the day itself. They carried little, a small loaf of bread, a strip of dried meat, a jar of preserves carefully hidden since autumn. Yet each gift was given as though it were a treasure. When they reached one another, there were no grand greetings, no laughter echoing across the snow, just nods, a few words, hands briefly clasped before the cold demanded they move again. But in that exchange, something larger passed between them, something wordless and old, the quiet understanding that none of them were truly alone in this vast frozen land. Children, wrapped in rough wool, followed behind their parents, dragging sticks through the snow, leaving winding trails like signatures of joy. One of them carried a small handmade toy, a carved wooden horse, its edges rough, its shape uneven, but the pride in his eyes made it radiant. He showed it to another child who stared in wonder, and for a brief moment both of them forgot the cold entirely. At one cabin, an old man opened his door to find a woman standing there with a pot of beans still steaming from her hearth. She smiled shyly, almost apologetic for offering something so simple, but the old man's face softened. He took the pot with both hands, and in that gesture, the entire meaning of the season seemed to settle between them. It wasn't about the food, it was about the reminder that even out here, kindness could find its way through the snow. As the afternoon deepened, voices began to carry faintly through the wind. Someone was singing, softly, uncertainly, a hymn half forgotten, its melody stretched and worn by time. One by one, others joined in from different cabins, their voices drifting across the distance, uneven and imperfect but strangely beautiful. There was no conductor, no plan, just scattered souls singing to one another across the frozen world. The sun, low and golden, brushed the tops of the snowdrifts, and the whole landscape seemed to glow. For a few precious hours, the frontier looked less like an exile and more like a promise, a place where the worst of winter could be met, not with despair but with stubborn, tender hope. And when the song finally faded, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of the sound of the wind, of the fire, of footsteps heading home, and of hearts quietly remembering that life, even stripped to its simplest form, could still feel sacred. By late afternoon, the light had begun to fade again, slowly and gracefully, as if reluctant to leave. The sun hovered low above the horizon, a pale disk behind the veil of drifting snow, and the land took on that quiet golden hue that comes only once a day, the moment when everything for a heartbeat seems to forgive the cold. The footsteps in the snow, the distant voices, the traces of smoke, all began to dissolve back into stillness. One by one, the settlers returned to their cabins. Doors closed softly, the faint thud of boots against wooden floors marking the rhythm of evening. Inside, the smell of wood smoke and melting snow filled the air again, and the last of the light slipped through cracks and frost-blurred windows, catching on rough-hewn tables and worn hands. The world outside darkened, but the rooms themselves seemed to grow warmer, as though the night and the light were trading places. The children, tired from the day's small adventures, gathered close to the fire. Some leaned against their mothers, others watched the sparks rise and vanish in the gloom. The flickering light painted their faces in shades of amber and rose, and in those shifting shadows, every face seemed older, wiser, softer. The adults spoke quietly. A few words about weather, about the livestock, about the next storm that might be coming. But beneath those words ran something deeper, the slow, steady current of shared endurance. The way their voices fell and rose together created a comfort language of its own, one that said, without needing to say it, "We made it through another day." Outside, the snow began again, gentle this time, almost shy. It fell past the windows in slow, spiraling flakes, each one catching the faint glow of lamplight as it passed. The sound it made on the roof was the softest imaginable, a faint whisper against wood, the kind of sound that made people draw blankets tighter and speak even more softly, as though afraid to disturb the peace. Someone began to hum, the same hymn that had drifted across the settlement earlier in the day. This time, it was quieter, almost a murmur. The tune filled the room, wrapping around them all like another kind of warmth. The mother smiled faintly as she listened. The father leaned back, eyes half closed, the lines of worry on his face softening for the first time in days. When the song ended, no one spoke. There was no applause, no reaction at all, just the steady sound of the fire breathing in the corner, the slow sigh of the wind outside, and the faint, rhythmic creak of the cabin as it settled deeper into the snow. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, not empty, but full of presence, full of the weight of the day, of gratitude unspoken, of everything they had endured to reach this point. And beyond their small walls, the entire west seemed to echo that stillness. The plains were asleep again, blanketed in white. The rivers frozen, the sky vast and endless, stars waiting to return. But somewhere beneath all that silence there pulsed a single, shared heartbeat, a quiet human rhythm that said, "We are here, we are together." And for now that is enough. Night crept back over the land as gently as it had left, not with haste but with patience, filling every hollow and hill, every frozen river and valley, until the entire frontier was once again covered by its great, quiet shadow. The sky had cleared after the snow, revealing a vault of stars so sharp and bright they looked close enough to touch. The cold deepened again, but it no longer felt cruel, only vast, inevitable, eternal. Inside the cabins, the fires burned low, flames thinned to embers, and their light settled into a deep orange glow that painted the walls with slow-moving warmth. The sound of crackling wood softened to a steady sigh, like the earth itself exhaling after a long day. Every sound became part of that stillness, the faint rustle of blankets, the whisper of a log collapsing in the fire, the quiet breathing of people drifting toward sleep. The father stared into the coals until his eyes grew heavy. In their shapes he thought he saw old maps, trails once traveled, the faint lines of rivers and valleys he had crossed long ago. He thought of the choices that had brought him here, the risks, the hopes, the losses, and though he did not smile, something inside him eased, as though the silence itself had offered its blessing. The mother lay beside him, one hand resting near the small cradle by the fire. Her eyelids fluttered with dreams, perhaps of warmer days, perhaps of the faraway home she'd left behind. In sleep, The lines of worry vanished from her face, replaced by the softness of memory. The child shifted once, sighed, and was still again. Outside, the wind changed direction. It no longer howled, no longer clawed at the roof or the walls. Instead, it moved like a whispering friend, circling the cabin, brushing lightly against it, as if to make sure all inside were safe. The snow, piled deep against the door, shone faintly under the starlight. The tracks from earlier were gone, erased completely, as though the day itself had been folded away, tucked gently beneath the surface of the earth. All across the plains the same silence held. The miner slept beside his cold fire, his hat pulled low over his face. The trapper's cabin glowed faintly through the frost, a small square of light against the endless white. The woman who had written her letter sat with it still beside her, the ink dry, her hands clasped loosely in her lap as she drifted into dreams. And beyond them all the land, immense, ancient, indifferent, listened quietly, as if it too understood what this night meant. It was not a night of miracles or angels. There were no choirs, no feasts, no gifts piled beneath a tree, and yet, everywhere the same truth lingered in the dark, that the smallest flame, guarded carefully, could hold back the vastness of the cold. Hours passed, the fire sank lower, the stars wheeled silently overhead, and in that deep blue-black stillness, the west itself seemed to sleep, cradling every cabin, every sleeper, every quiet heart beneath its frozen sky. The world for that one night felt whole. When dawn returned, it came quietly, almost shyly, as though it feared to wake the sleeping world too soon. The first light was pale and fragile, brushing the snow in faint silver streaks, barely enough to define the horizon. The land was still, wrapped in silence so deep that even the crack of melting frost seemed like a voice. It was morning again, another beginning. The frontier stirred. One by one the fires were coaxed back to life, smoke rising once more into the pale air. The same rhythm that had carried them through the day before began again, the steady, simple cycle of tending, mending, feeding, and enduring. Yet something in the air felt different, gentler, almost reverent. Perhaps it was because of the night they had just lived, that long, unbroken quiet in which the world had seemed to breathe with them, instead of against them. Out on the plains, the snow reflected the new light like water. The sky above was soft and limitless, the kind of blue that promises warmth even when the cold still lingers. From a distance, the cabins looked impossibly small, but smoke rose from each one like a thread, delicate yet certain, proof that life, however fragile, still held on. Inside those small homes, people moved slowly, with that particular grace that follows hardship. They didn't speak of Christmas anymore. There was no need. The meaning of it had already sunk into the bones of the day itself, in the crackle of firewood, in the smell of bread baking, in the steady pulse of life continuing despite everything. What they built in those winters was not just survival, it was a kind of faith that didn't need to be spoken or celebrated, a quiet understanding that light, when it is most needed, will always return. Their children would carry that truth forward, often without realizing it, in the way they worked, the way they prayed, the way they looked to the horizon, and believed there was always something beyond it. Years later, when towns would rise where there had once been wilderness, when the sound of train whistles replaced the wind and the streets glowed with lamplight, the people would still pause when snow began to fall. They would still lower their voices and listen to the hush that covered the world, that old familiar stillness that once held the pioneers in its hands. And somewhere in that quiet, they would feel it again, that small sacred warmth born not from abundance but from endurance, the kind of warmth that only those who have truly known the cold can understand. Perhaps that is what remains of those first frontier Christmases, not their hardship, not their hunger, not their loneliness, but their peace, a peace earned the hard way, through patience, humility, and faith that refused to die out, no matter how long the winter lasted. Outside, the snow continued to fall in soft, steady silence, covering the old tracks, smoothing the edges of the world once more. The light grew stronger, the fires burned brighter, and the story, their story, went on. Beyond the edges of that winter, beyond the horizon where the mountains rise like ghosts, the world kept changing. Seasons turned, rivers shifted their paths, and the small footprints of the first settlers vanished beneath layers of time. But something of them endured, not in the earth they claimed, nor in the towns that would follow, but in the quiet strength that had lived inside their hearts. Every winter since then has carried an echo of theirs, the same hush before dawn, the same tremor of cold beneath the door, the same need to gather warmth from what little remains. Though we live now among lights and voices, surrounded by the hum of comfort, there is still a part of us that understands that silence, that ancient, beautiful silence of survival. When the snow falls today, it falls on the same land they once crossed barefoot, with hope and fear tangled together in their chests. The world above it may have changed. New roads, new borders, new cities glowing like stars, but the snow does not change. It falls as it always has, softly, endlessly, without asking permission, covering the noise of human striving, until all that remains is stillness. And perhaps, in that stillness, we meet them again, the miners and trappers, the mothers and children, the lonely travelers in their cabins of wood and clay. We meet them not in memory, but in feeling, that faint warmth in the heart when we light a candle against the dark, that fragile peace that fills a room when everyone grows quiet at once. For that was their gift to the world, not conquest or glory, but endurance wrapped in gentleness, a reminder that the smallest flame, if guarded with care, can light an entire winter night. Even now, as we sit under our own roofs, some of us in cities, some in distant villages, some listening in the hush of our rooms, we are part of that same story. We still tend our fires, still look to the horizon, still believe that warmth can outlast the cold. And when the year grows dark again, when December stretches long and still, and the wind begins to sound like an old song over the rooftops, we remember them, the pioneers of faith and frost, and we understand that what they built was not just a way of life, but a way of believing that no matter how far from home we travel, the light will always return, the snow outside deepens, the sky softens to dusk again, and somewhere, in a cabin that no longer stands but still exists in the mind, a fire burns quietly on, its glow never fading, its warmth still reaching us across the centuries. There comes a point, somewhere beyond the reach of clocks, when history and dream become the same thing. The names fade first, then the dates, then the wooden walls themselves, until all that remains is the feeling, that steady pulse of warmth beneath an endless sky. It moves through the centuries like breath, threading from one winter to the next. Every snow that falls carries the weight of that breath. It drifts through cities now, between towers of glass and light, yet for a heartbeat the air feels the same as it did out on the plains, clean, cold, sacred. A single flake lands on a mitten, melts and vanishes, and in that vanishing is the whole story, everything fragile, everything fleeting, everything worth keeping alive. Somewhere in the world tonight, a candle is being lit, in a hospital window, in a farmhouse kitchen, in a quiet apartment where someone sits alone but not entirely lonely. The flame bends slightly, as though listening, and the light it gives is small, but it is real. It travels outward, across rooms, across oceans, across years, joining 1,000 other small, imperfect flames. Together they become a kind of constellation that no night can erase. And this is what the pioneers knew, without needing to name it, that light is never loud, never certain, but it returns after the storm, after the hunger, after the long and faithless dark. It returns because someone somewhere believes it will, and belief, in its quietest form, is stronger than any wind. The frontier has vanished now, its cabins long buried under grass and dust, but the sound of the fire remains, that soft, steady crackle that feels like a heartbeat. It lives in every story whispered at night, in every breath taken beside a window glowing with frost, in every person who listens just a little longer before sleep. And if you close your eyes now and let the quiet wrap around you, you might still hear it. The faint murmur of snow against wood, the sigh of a world resting, the echo of people who once sat just as you do now, waiting for the dawn. The wind moves softly through time, carrying their warmth forward, carrying it still. The stars hang lower now, heavy and bright, scattered across a sky so deep it almost hums. The snow no longer sparkles, it glows, a dim, even light that seems to rise from the earth itself. Every sound has slowed, even the wind drifts more gently, tracing invisible paths across the open land. Inside the mine's cabin, the fire is small but steady. It has burned through every hour of the night, and still it endures, a tiny golden heart in the dark. Its warmth seeps into the walls, into the wood, into the air. The smell of smoke and pine and faint bread lingers, familiar, human, kind. Breath by breath, the room becomes lighter. The night thins. The silence grows wide enough to rest inside. Somewhere beyond the door, a single flake falls, touches the step and vanishes. Somewhere far away, another fire flickers in answer. One flame recognizing another. The world feels enormous again, and gentle. You can almost feel the slow turning of it, the pulse of the earth beneath the snow, the quiet promise of morning waiting just beyond the horizon, the same promise that carried those settlers through their winters, the same that carries you through yours. In the stillness, the crackle of the fire becomes a lullaby, a rhythm older than language, a sound that says you have done enough for today. The walls breathe, the stars fade, the last ember glows and dims. Outside, the snow keeps falling, endlessly, softly, covering every road, every track, every worry, until the world is smooth again. And in that smooth, endless white, the story doesn't end. It simply sleeps, waiting for the next voice, the next candle, the next small hand reaching out in the dark to make warmth again. Rest now. The fire will keep, the light will find you when you wake. Somewhere, beyond the reach of the night, light begins to move. Not sunrise yet, just the faintest shimmer, like the sky remembering that it once held a sun. It slides across the snow in thin ribbons, pooling in hollows, touching the tips of bare branches until they glint like threads of glass. The land exhales. The long, frozen silence loosens its hold. Inside the cabin, the last ember flares once, then falls quiet. Smoke curls upward through the chimney, pale against the dim sky. The people within sleep deeply, dreamlessly, wrapped in the hush that only comes after endurance. There are no words left, no need for them, only breath, only warmth. Beyond their walls the world is stirring. A fox pads silently across the drifts, its fur thick and white, its paws leaving perfect prints that sparkle briefly before the wind erases them. A bird calls once, thin, high, testing the morning, and the sound carries farther than it should, over frozen rivers and quiet woods, over the great unbroken spaces that still remember what it was to be wild. And somewhere farther still, another cabin wakes. A door creaks open, and the first figure steps into the cold. The air bites, sharp and clean. Frost cracks underfoot. The person pauses, looking east where the sky has just begun to blush. The color is faint, rose then gold, a slow bloom across the endless white. It's enough to draw a breath that feels new, and the sound of that breath joins all the others rising unseen across the plains. Every cabin, every camp, every tiny fire left smouldering through the night, all of them begin to wake. You can almost see it from above, smoke spiraling upward like the world is breathing again. Thousands of small pulses of life stitched into the fabric of the morning. The cold doesn't vanish, and the work doesn't end, but something has shifted. The day carries a gentleness born from having survived the dark. The settlers will split wood, haul water, mend fences, feed the horses. They'll laugh a little when their breath fogs in the air. When the sun finally catches the snow and makes it shine, and none of them will say it aloud, but each will feel it, that strange, steady joy that rises only after hardship, the kind that needs no celebration, no witness, no name. In that slow, brightening morning, the west no longer feels so empty. The sky stretches wide, the snow glows like glass, and every sound, the crack of ice, the rustle of hay, the faint hum of voices, feels like proof of life itself. And if you listen closely, beneath it all you can still hear the same song that's been playing since the first fire was lit. The quiet rhythm of hope, soft as a heartbeat, older than history, waiting patiently for the world to open its eyes again. By mid-morning, the world had begun to glitter again. Sunlight poured softly across the plains, breaking into thousands of shards where it met the snow. The air was clear now, sharp and cold enough to sting the skin, yet somehow lighter, as if the earth itself had exhaled after holding its breath all through the night. The frost on the cabin windows melted into fine silver beads that trickled down in thin, shining threads. Inside, the family stirred one by one, blinking in the light. The father rose first, brushing the cold from his coat, while the mother rekindled the stove, feeding it the last of the small wood pile beside the door. Soon the familiar crackle returned, that patient sound that had carried them through every winter. The warmth crept back slowly, not rushing but growing with purpose, the way sunlight spreads over the snow outside. The children woke next, rubbing their eyes, hair tangled from sleep. The smallest of them crawled closer to the stove and sat quietly, palms outstretched toward the heat, a small smile on her face. There were no gifts waiting, no ribbons, no feast, just the same humble breakfast as yesterday, and yet something about it felt richer, sweeter, as if the night had blessed it with meaning. The father stepped outside to fetch water from the barrel. The lid was frozen solid, so he struck it gently with the back of an axe until it cracked, releasing a sound like shattering glass. The water beneath gleamed, perfectly still, reflecting the pale blue of the sky. For a moment he stood there, watching his own breath drift upward in the sunlight, the faint plume dissolving into air. Then he smiled, a small, quiet smile, the kind that never reaches the mouth, only the eyes. Around the settlement, other cabins were waking too. Smoke rose straight and steady now, no longer torn by the wind. You could hear faint laughter in the distance, the sound of neighbors calling to one another, of animals stirring in their pens. A dog barked once, muffled by snow, and somewhere farther off, a cow lowed softly, its breath rising like mist. Inside, the mother was mending a small tear in her daughter's sleeve. Her fingers were stiff, but careful. The thread caught the light with each pull, and the rhythm of her work matched the rhythm of the fire's gentle crackle. Across from her, the father poured hot water into a tin cup, the steam curling upward like prayer. They didn't speak of the night, or of Christmas, or of the long month still ahead. They didn't need to. The meaning of the day lived quietly between them, in the simple act of waking, of rebuilding, of choosing once again to face the world with steady hearts. By noon, the sky was a clear, blinding white blue. The snow had begun to soften along the edges, small drops of water glinting like diamonds on the eaves of the cabin. The children ventured outside, their laughter spilling across the plain like a melody. They rolled in the snow, their cheeks pink, their voices echoing far, the only sound in a world of endless silence. The parents watched from the doorway, the sunlight turning their faces gold. For a moment the cold didn't matter, the hunger didn't matter, the distance didn't matter. All that existed was this: a small family, a small cabin, a small fire, and a vast, forgiving sky above it all. And in that fragile balance the frontier seemed less cruel, less endless. It felt, for the first time, almost gentle, as though the land itself had decided to keep them another day. As the sun climbed higher, its light grew warmer, stretching long and soft across the snow. The sky was a pale, delicate blue, and for the first time in days, a few small clouds drifted lazily toward the horizon, thin wisps that looked more like smoke than weather. The land shimmered faintly, every ridge and hollow dressed in gold. The settlers knew this calm wouldn't last. Winter had many moods and gentleness was only one of them, but for now they worked as if time itself had slowed. Steady, patient, reverent. The father carried his axe to the edge of the woods, boots sinking into snow that glittered like crushed glass. Each swing sent a soft echo through the trees, dull and rhythmic, a heartbeat of work against the stillness. The wood split clean, and the sound, that solid crack of survival, was almost satisfying enough to feel like music. Back at the cabin, the mother hung damp clothes near the stove to dry. The scent of smoke and fabric filled the room, mingling with the faint sweetness of something baking, a small pan of biscuits made from the last of the flour. She moved quietly, humming to herself, her voice so soft it could have been mistaken for part of the wind. Outside, the children played until their laughter blended with the sound of the axe. They built small forts from packed snow, carved tunnels, and lay on their backs watching clouds drift across the sky. Their cheeks were bright and their fingers numb, but they didn't notice. Childhood had a way of finding joy in the smallest scraps of warmth. When the father returned with an armful of wood, the door creaked and the sudden rush of cold filled the room for just a moment. The mother turned from the stove, wiping her hands on her apron, and smiled without speaking. He set the wood down carefully, brushed snow from his sleeves, and nodded toward the biscuits cooling on the edge of the stove. It was all the conversation they needed. They ate together in the golden light of afternoon. The bread was coarse and heavy, but fresh, the kind of food that carries the taste of effort. Outside, the wind had gone quiet again, and for a while the only sound was the faint hiss of the fire and the slow rhythm of chewing. After the meal, the father mended a broken handle on his shovel, the sound of his knife scraping wood blending with the soft clatter of the mother's sewing. The children lay on the floor beside the fire, whispering stories, tracing shapes into the layer of dust that coated the boards. And through it all, light drifted through the windows, thin, shimmering and alive. It moved across the walls, over the tools, over their hands, over the simple objects that made up their world. For a little while, the cabin felt almost suspended in time, a place between day and night, between labor and rest, between the world that had been and the one still coming into being. The father looked toward the door, where the light formed a narrow band across the floor. "It's changing," he said softly. The mother looked up, then nodded. Outside, the color of the snow was already turning from gold to blue. Shadows stretched long and slow across the land, and the day, though still bright, had begun to tilt toward evening. Soon, the fire would need feeding again. The chores would start their endless circle once more. But for now, in this fleeting hour, there was peace. Not the kind that shouted, but the kind that simply existed, steady as breath. And when the first chill crept back through the cracks in the walls, they welcomed it like an old friend, knowing it was only reminding them that warmth had meaning. By the time the sun touched the edge of the plains, the light had turned to amber, shadows grew long across the drifts, and the snow reflected every color of the sky, pale rose, faint violet, deepening blue. The world seemed to hold its breath once more, as if reluctant to let the day go. Inside the cabin, the family moved with unspoken harmony, each motion careful and practiced. The father stacked the new wood by the door, brushing snow from his shoulders before closing it against the wind. The mother set a pot over the stove, the faint hiss of boiling water mingling with the creak of settling timbers. The scent of smoke and earth filled the small space again, familiar, anchoring, real. The children gathered close to the fire. One of them traced circles into the dusty floorboards with a stick. Another stared at the orange light flickering along the wall, watching it twist and ripple like something alive. The fire cracked softly, throwing sparks that glowed bright for a heartbeat before fading into the dark. Outside, the last of the light slipped away. The wind rose and then fell again, its voice no longer sharp but weary, moving gently through the gaps in the wood. The sounds of the settlement drifted faintly, the distant bark of a dog, the clatter of a shovel against frozen earth, a single laugh quickly swallowed by the cold. When supper was ready, they ate quietly. The stew was thin but warm, the bread coarse but comforting. Each bite carried the taste of the day's labor, of wood split and fires fed, of water hauled from beneath the ice. When they were done, the mother poured what remained of the water into a small tin mug, handed it to the youngest, and smiled. It was a small gesture, but in it lived the whole meaning of the season, the giving of the last good thing, simply because love demanded it. Afterward, the father trimmed the lamp wick and the glow deepened, spreading golden light over the walls. The mother took out her sewing once more, her fingers moving in calm, steady rhythm. The children leaned against one another, their heads heavy with sleep. The cabin's warmth was soft and fragile, like a bubble of breath in the frozen night. The father began to speak then, not loudly, not as a story, but as a remembering. He told them about the place he'd come from, where winters smelled of pine and rivers never froze solid, where Christmas had once meant church bells and neighbors walking through snow that barely touched their boots. His voice was slow, even, carrying the rhythm of someone who no longer expected to be heard beyond the room. Yet the children listened anyway, eyes half closed, hearts wide open. Outside, the moon had risen, low and yellow, heavy over the horizon. Its light spread thinly across the snow, catching on fences and roofs, tracing the shape of the world in silver. The whole land seemed to glow from within. The father's story faded, his words dissolving into silence. The mother looked up, her face lit softly by the lamplight, and their eyes met for a moment. Two people held together by years of winter and firelight and quiet endurance. Nothing was said, because nothing needed to be. The wind brushed against the walls once more, gentle now like a hand passing over a child's hair. The fire crackled. The lamp flickered. The night closed in, warm and calm and endless. And in that small circle of light, the world felt whole again, the same way it had the night before, the same way it always would when hearts remembered how to be still. By the time midnight settled over the plains, the wind had vanished entirely. The air hung still, heavy with frost, and the world outside seemed carved from light and silence. Every surface glittered with ice, the fences, the trees, even the frozen rope by the well, each one catching the pale gleam of the moon. It was so quiet that the creak of the cabin timbers sounded enormous, like the earth itself shifting in its sleep. Inside, the fire had burned down to a soft bed of coals, glowing faintly in the stove's belly. The room was dark except for that pulse of light and the thin, trembling flame of the oil lamp. The family slept close, their breaths rising and falling in the same slow rhythm, a chorus of calm that matched the night beyond the walls. In the faint light, the mother's sewing lay folded beside her chair, the thread still looped through the needle, as if she had stopped mid-stitch and simply drifted into dreams. The father's boots rested near the door, a crust of frost forming along their seams. The children lay tangled in blankets, one hand resting on the dog's back, its fur rising gently with each sleepy breath. Outside, snow began to fall again, thin flakes at first, then heavier, sweeping across the plains like veils of smoke. They made no sound as they landed, only a soft hiss when they met the chimney's warmth. The sky had no edges anymore. The land and heaven were one endless whiteness. Somewhere far away, another door creaked open. A trapper stepped out of his hut to feed the fire beneath a kettle, the glow of his lantern catching in the snow before the dark swallowed it again. Across the distance, that brief flare of light looked like a star, one of hundreds that dotted the sleeping frontier. Back in the cabin, the fire sighed and shifted, and for a moment the coals flared bright enough to paint the walls in shades of red and gold. The father stirred in his sleep, murmured something wordless, and was still again. The warmth held, thin but steady. The moon climbed higher. Its light spilled through the cracks in the roof and touched the floor in narrow ribbons, pale and perfect. Time lost its meaning. There was no past here, no future, only the steady rhythm of hearts beating, wood settling, snow falling, and in that fragile silence the world felt almost weightless. The old fears of the frontier, the hunger, the storms, the distance, all seemed to melt away, leaving only the pure simplicity of being alive in the middle of winter, surrounded by the endless hush of creation itself. It was a holy stillness, not born of ceremony or song, but of exhaustion, gratitude, and the quiet certainty that morning would come again. Far out on the horizon, something subtle began to change. The stars, brilliant only a moment before, dulled one by one, as if someone had drawn a thin curtain of light across the sky. The moon paled, its sharp edges softening. Over the frozen plains the first breath of dawn whispered. Not warmth yet, only a faint thinning of the dark. Inside the cabin the air had cooled, but the fire still lived, a handful of embers deep in the ashes, dim but faithful. The father woke first, not from noise, but from the strange brightness pressing through the cracks in the wall. He sat up slowly, listening. No wind, no storm, only the soft hush of snow falling in a world that had forgotten how to move. He rose, fed the coals a few slivers of wood, and watched them bloom back into orange life. The light touched his hands, his breath fogged faintly, and he smiled at the small miracle of it. How something so small could still push back against the vast cold. Outside, the world was silver and still. The snow had buried everything that came before, the footprints, the tools, even the rough path to the woodpile. All of it smoothed into one unbroken surface. Yet when the man opened the door, the air that met him was clear, sharp, full of promise. Above the eastern horizon, a thin gold line stretched wider and brighter with every breath. Behind him, the children stirred. The mother blinked awake, her hair caught by the light spilling through the doorway. No one spoke. They only watched as the color grew, from grey to pearl, from pearl to amber, until the first true ray of sun broke over the land. It struck the cabin roof, the frost on the window, the snow piled high against the fence. Each thing it touched seemed to wake, to remember itself. The world began to sparkle again. Millions of tiny fires kindled by the returning day. For a moment, everything was motionless, as if creation itself were pausing to take a breath. Then sound returned, the faint crackle of the thaw, the wing beat of a bird rising from a branch, the whisper of snow sliding from the roof. Life was beginning again, quiet but unstoppable. The father closed the door gently and turned back toward the room. "It's morning," he said, his voice low and steady. The mother smiled. The children laughed softly, still wrapped in blankets. The fire crackled brighter. Outside, the sun climbed higher, washing away the last trace of night. Across the plains, other doors opened, other fires were stoked, other breaths fogged the new air. 1,000 tiny resurrections happening all at once. And so the West woke once more. The same land, the same endless snow, but beneath it all, the faint stirring of roots, of warmth, of another season waiting patiently to begin. By the end of the week, the snow no longer fell in silence. It came down in soft bursts, melting as it touched the roofs, running in thin silver veins along the eaves. The air had changed, still cold, still sharp, but carrying something new within it, a scent so faint you could miss it if you breathed too fast. It was the smell of water, of thawed earth hiding somewhere far below the frost. The father noticed it first while splitting wood outside. Each swing of the axe echoed differently. Now the sound was softer, less brittle. The snow beneath his boots sank instead of cracking. When he lifted his head, he heard it. The faint drip of melting ice from the branches above. He paused, closed his eyes, and listened. It was the first song of spring, played in notes of water and sunlight. Inside, the mother had opened the cabin door a little wider than usual. The air that came in was cold but alive, carrying with it a brightness that the children followed like a magnet. They stood in the doorway, blinking, their cheeks pink from the chill, watching the light spill across the yard. The oldest pointed toward a patch of earth near the fence where the snow had pulled back just enough to reveal the color of soil, dark, wet, and new. That afternoon, they all went outside together. The snow still reached their knees, but the sky was a high, soft blue, and the sun touched their faces like a hand long absent. They laughed, not loudly, just that small laughter that slips out when the world surprises you with gentleness. The father began to clear the path to the barn. The sound of his shovel rang bright in the air, scattering echoes that drifted away like birds. The mother brushed snow from the window ledges and looked out toward the hills, where a thin fog of mist was rising, ghostly and gold in the light. The children built small channels in the snow to watch the water run, pretending they were great rivers flowing toward the sea. Everywhere, movement returned. The wind no longer howled. It murmured. The trees, stiff with ice, began to creak again, stretching toward the light. Even the dog, who had spent most of winter sleeping near the fire, bounded out into the drifts, leaving a wild path of joy behind him. That night, when they came back inside, their faces glowed from the cold and the laughter. The fire crackled brightly, almost playful now, and the cabin smelled of melting snow and pine smoke. They ate in silence. The good kind, the kind that sits between people who know they've seen something worth remembering. Outside, the moon hung thin and white, its light pooling in the thawing hollows. The snow was still deep, but it was changing fast. Beneath it, the first trickles of running water sang quietly through the roots of sleeping grass. The frontier was waking again, not all at once, but like a great creature stirring from a long, slow dream. And the people, these small, patient souls who had kept their fires burning through the coldest nights, felt the world shifting with them, softening, breathing, forgiving. The change came almost invisibly at first, in small sounds that no one noticed until they were everywhere. The dripping from the eaves, the soft crack of ice surrendering beneath the sun, the distant gurgle of streams that had slept all winter, and now began to move again. The air carried new tones, not just the hush of snow and wind, but the faint murmur of running water, the whisper of branches shaking free from their glassy armor. Each morning, the light lasted longer. The sunrise no longer glowed pale and weak. It came golden and wide, touching everything with warmth that stayed. Shadows grew sharper, the sky deepened in color, and the world that had been only white for months began to hint at the first shy shades of brown and green. The father noticed the change in the wood first. When he split the logs, sap ran beneath the bark, a thin, sweet scent of life that clung to his hands. He wiped them on his coat, smiled, and said nothing, but the look in his eyes told the story. The mother began to open the windows for an hour each day, letting in the fresh air that carried the faraway cry of migrating birds. It was the first sound of distance she had heard in months, the sound of something alive beyond their little valley. The children found puddles forming near the fence, and stamped their boots in them with delight, laughing at the way the ice shattered into tiny mirrors. They followed the thin streams of water down the slope behind the cabin, tracing where they met and ran together like veins of silver in the snow. That night, when the stars returned, they seemed warmer too, not sharp and cold as before, but blurred by a thin mist that hung low over the plains. The moonlight no longer froze the land, it softened it. Even the wind had changed its tone, no longer a howl but a sigh, a weary song of departure. The animals felt it too. The horses pawed at the ground, noses twitching for the scent of grass hidden beneath the melting crust. The dog barked at nothing, and ran in circles through the mud. Somewhere in the distance a coyote's call echoed, not the hungry cry of winter, but the restless one of spring. As the days passed, the snow shrank back from the earth, revealing the dark, rich soil beneath. The world smelled different now, damp, fertile, alive. The first shoots appeared near the south wall of the cabin, thin and green, fragile but sure. The mother bent to touch them, smiling, as if greeting an old friend. Inside, they began to plan, small plans at first, spoken quietly over the evening fire. Which field to plough first, how much seed remained, when to ride to town for supplies. The future was suddenly real again, tangible, like something they could reach out and hold. The fire still burned each night, but now its glow felt less like defiance and more like comfort, a reminder, not a shield. The days were longer, the nights softer, and the cold, once a master, had become a guest preparing to leave. And when the last crust of ice melted from the roof, it fell with a sound like laughter, the voice of winter saying goodbye. The west, wide and endless, breathed deeply once more. The rivers ran, the birds returned, and the people who had endured so much in silence stepped out into the light again. When spring finally arrived, it did not come as a single moment, but as a slow rising of the world, the way a deep sleeper begins to stir after a dream. The snow was gone from the fields, except for a few stubborn drifts in the shade of the trees. Water glimmered in every hollow, the creeks ran high, their edges foaming where the ice still clung. The air no longer smelled of smoke but of soil, wet, raw, rich, and the first faint sweetness of new grass. The father hitched the mare and turned the soil for the first time that year. The earth was heavy, but it moved easily under the blade, black and shining. Each furrow steamed faintly in the morning light, releasing a scent that filled his chest like a memory of life itself. Behind him the youngest child followed, pressing small footprints into the damp earth, laughing when the mud clung to his boots. The mother worked beside the cabin, repairing the garden fence and setting aside the last of the winter stores. When she lifted her face to the breeze, it was warm for the first time in months. Her hair caught the sunlight, and for a moment she stood perfectly still, eyes closed, listening to the new world breathe. Somewhere in the distance, frogs croaked in a flooded ditch, a meadowlark sang from a fence post, and the air shimmered with the hum of insects returned from their long hiding. Everywhere colour replaced silence. Green crept along the edges of the fields, spread through the willows, and climbed up the low hills. The river, freed from its armour of ice, ran fast and clear, carrying with it fragments of branches, leaves, and the smell of faraway mountains. At dusk, when the sky turned violet, the water caught the colour and carried it downstream until it vanished into darkness. The children gathered flowers, small, bright things with thin petals, and brought them inside to place in a chipped jar on the table. They didn't last long in the warmth, but for the brief hours they stood there, the cabin felt like a new place entirely. Neighbours began to visit again. You could see them coming across the open land, figures small against the horizon, their horses kicking up sprays of mud. They brought news of births, of new crops, of plans for fences and wells. Laughter returned to the settlement, cautious at first, then freer as the days grew longer. At night, when the fires burned low, no one spoke of the winter just past. It lingered only in the silence between words, in the way hands lingered a moment longer around a mug, in the way eyes softened when they met. The memory of the cold did not disappear. It became something gentler, a shape in the background of every kindness. The prairie was alive now. Calves tottered in the fields, colts kicked up sprays of mud beside their mothers, and the first wild geese streaked north across the sky. Their cries echoed high above the cabins like the sound of the world beginning again. And when the sun set, its light spread in long liquid bands of gold. The people watched it without speaking, each of them knowing, though none would say it aloud, that they had seen the world die and be reborn, and that somewhere within that cycle lay the quiet truth of everything. It began with a change in the air, a heaviness, a taste of iron on the tongue, a pulse that seemed to come from the ground itself. The father felt it before the clouds even appeared. He stood by the fence, wiping his hands on his trousers, and looked west. The sky had grown darker there, not with night, but with something alive and moving. The wind came first, low and slow, bending the new grass and whispering through the bare branches. It carried warmth and the scent of faraway rain, that sharp, clean smell that meant the earth was about to drink again. The animals shifted restlessly in their pens. The mare lifted her head and snorted. The dog circled once, uneasy, before lying down with his ears twitching. When the first drop fell, it was fat and cold, darkening the dust where it landed. Then another, Then 100. The sky broke open and the sound filled the world, 1,000 small impacts merging into one steady roar. The family watched from the doorway, pressed close together, their faces lit by flashes of pale light. The rain came down in silver sheets, hammering the roof, running in bright streams off the eaves. It was loud, chaotic, wild, but not frightening. It was the sound of the world remembering itself. The thunder rolled long and deep, not sharp like anger but vast, echoing across the plains until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The father smiled faintly, that quiet, private smile of someone who knows this is what the land needs. The mother leaned against him, her hair damp from the spray, and whispered something no one could hear over the rain. The children laughed, pressing their palms against the doorframe to feel the tremble of the thunder. Outside, the fields shimmered under the downpour, the furrows filled with water, small rivers twisting through the soil. The scent of wet earth rose thick and rich, the smell of life returning in earnest. Lightning flickered across the horizon, lighting the sky in white fire, then fading back into darkness. The pauses between the thunder grew shorter, as if the heavens were breathing faster, closer. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the storm shifted. The rain softened to a drizzle. The wind lost its edge. The thunder moved east, its rumble growing faint. The clouds broke open, and through them the last light of evening spilled across the land, soft gold against silver puddles. Every surface gleamed. The air was warm and sweet, and the first frog called from the ditch near the fence. When they stepped outside, the family's boots sank into mud that glistened like black glass. The sky above was still streaked with light, pink fading to violet, violet to blue. They walked a little way into the field, letting the rain soak their clothes. Their hair, the world around them, steamed and shone. The father knelt and pressed his palm into the wet soil. It was soft now, pliant, alive. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "We're ready." No one asked for what. Everyone understood. The rain had not washed the world clean. It had brought it back to life. And in that new wet quiet where the scent of earth and lightning mingled, everything that had slept, the roots, the seeds, the hearts of people, began to move again. After the storm, the days unfolded in a gentle rhythm of color and sound. The wind no longer howled through bare branches. It sang, brushing over young leaves that trembled like tiny bells. The plains, once white and endless, turned green so quickly that it seemed a miracle had passed in the night. Every morning began the same way. The faint smell of damp soil, the murmur of water still running in the ditches, the thin blue smoke from a dozen cabins rising straight into the clear sky. The father walked the fields before the sun had cleared the hills, his boots sinking into earth soft as bread. Behind him the mare pulled the plough, her breath steaming, her steps sure. The blade turned the soil in slow, even lines, each furrow dark and shining, a promise buried in every pass. By midday the air shimmered with warmth. The mother tended to the garden, pressing seeds carefully into the moist rows, beans, squash, a handful of corn saved from last year's harvest. She worked silently, a thin smile at the corners of her mouth, humming an old song that rose and fell with the wind. The children carried water from the barrel, splashing it across the roots, their laughter spilling over the sound of frogs and insects. They chased the dog between the rows, their footprints dark against the new green. When they tired, they sat in the shade of the wagon, watching clouds drift like ships across the sky. At night, when the heat broke and the first stars appeared, the world glowed faintly. Fireflies rose from the grass in slow spirals, their lights blinking like soft thoughts. The family ate outside now. Bread, beans, whatever had lasted through the winter, and the air was full of the smell of wet earth and smoke. Sometimes the neighbors came, walking over fields that gleamed under the moon. They shared coffee, traded tools, spoke in low voices about the planting, about fences, about the way the river had changed course again. Their talk was quiet, steady, threaded with a calm that came only from people who had learned the rhythm of the land. The father would look out across the fields while they talked, his eyes following the faint silver of the river winding away toward the horizon. The sound of the frogs carried through the darkness, a slow, constant song that filled the pauses between words. "Listen to that," he'd say softly. "That's the sound of the earth breathing again." When the guests left, the family lingered a while longer outside. The children lay on their backs in the grass, pointing at constellations the parents could no longer name. The fire crackled low, the stars mirrored in the small pool beside the cabin door. It was a peaceful kind of fullness, not abundance, not comfort, but the quiet knowing that the worst had passed and life, stubborn as ever, had returned. The land that had frozen, howled and thundered now rested under a wide, forgiving sky. The crops would come slowly, the storms would return, and winters would still be long. But for now, in the soft air of spring, everything was alive again. By midsummer, the frontier had changed completely. The snow, the hunger, the silence, all of it felt like something that had happened in another lifetime. The fields were high and green now, heavy with grain that swayed in slow waves beneath the wind. The river ran full and bright, catching the sunlight like a ribbon of silver, and everywhere the air carried the hum of insects, the rhythm of life that had returned in full. The father worked the fields from dawn to dusk, his hands rough but steady, his movements unhurried. Each stroke of the scythe made a whisper through the tall grass, the sound rising and falling like breathing. The mother hung linens outside the cabin, their white cloth glowing in the afternoon light. The children ran barefoot through the meadow, their laughter floating over the sound of the wind. When evening came, the sky stretched wide and gold, the color of warmth itself. The family gathered outside for supper. Bread baked from the last of the winter's flour, milk, a handful of berries gathered from the edge of the woods. It was simple, but in its simplicity there was grace. They ate slowly, as if aware that moments like these were meant to be noticed. The father leaned back against the doorframe, eyes on the fields. The mother's head rested lightly on his shoulder. The children had grown quiet, drawing in the dust with sticks, the shapes meaningless but full of imagination. The dog slept near the fire, tail flicking at flies. The smell of wildflowers and smoke drifted in the warm air. When the sun finally sank, it did so slowly, tenderly, turning the sky to amber, then rose, then violet. Fireflies began to rise from the tall grass again, filling the dusk with small, trembling lights. Somewhere far off, thunder grumbled, not in warning but in promise. The father watched the horizon, the faint glimmer of lightning behind the clouds. "It's Sichel rain tomorrow," he said quietly. "Good," the mother answered, her voice soft as the breeze. "The earth could use it." They stayed like that for a long time, saying nothing more. The night deepened, and one by one the stars appeared, bright and calm and endless. The same stars that had watched them through the bitter winter, through the silence and the cold, now shone in warmth and peace. Inside, the cabin glowed faintly with lamplight. The fields whispered. The river kept its slow, steady song. And somewhere in that rhythm, in the wind, in the fire, in the stillness of the night, lived the truth they had carried all along, that every winter ends, every light returns, and that survival itself is a kind of grace. The frontier no longer felt wild, it felt alive. And as the night settled, soft and full, the world held its breath, the same way it had at the very beginning, waiting for the next dawn, the next story, the next quiet season of hope.